This machine back here is my Xtool D1 Pro, and the cheapest you can get one of these machines for today is a little bit under $400. And this over here is my Xtool P2, which at the time of recording goes for a little bit under $4,000. And since I've got one of each of these machines in my shop, it occurred to me that this provided a pretty interesting opportunity to do a comparison between what you get on the low end versus the higher end of the entry-level laser engraver market. But once you get into the details, you realize that this is not simply a story of how much better the more expensive machine is, because these cheaper machines actually have two unique advantages other than price that actually makes them much better in certain situations. So in this video, I'll walk you through what I think are the 8 biggest differences between these two machines when it comes to real-world use. We'll start with the core differences between the two machines, and we'll work our way up to the more creative differences. So safety first, there are some clear differences when it comes to the safety features which are built into these two different machines. For example, the $400 laser is going to be open frame, which means you're probably going to want to build or buy some sort of enclosure to help you deal with fumes and eye protection. On the other hand, the $4,000 laser has an enclosure built in, and it also comes with other safety features like an auto lock lid that keeps it shut while the laser is running, and this easy to reach emergency shut-off button. It also technically has a built-in exhaust fan to help evacuate the fumes while the laser is running, but it's not very powerful, which is why I still have mine hooked up to an external inline exhaust fan. Moving right along, difference number 2 is speed. And if you thought that the more expensive $4,000 laser is going to be a lot faster than the $400 laser, well, then you would be right. You would be absolutely right. To put this into perspective, my typical speeds on my 10-watt D1 Pro for 1/4-inch maple plywood is usually around 225 millimeters per minute for cuts, and around 9,000 millimeters per minute for engraving. On the other hand, if I'm using the same material on my Xtool P2, my typical speeds are going to be around 720 millimeters per minute for a cut, and around 18,000 millimeters per minute for an engraving. And if we do the math for comparison here, we can see that that comes out to about 3.2 times faster for cuts and about 2 times faster for engravings, which is a pretty significant difference. Plus, if you went for the cheapest available D1 Pro that comes in under $400 like I showed at the beginning of this video, then what you're going to be getting is a 5-watt unit, which would be even slower than the 10-watt D1 Pro that I have here for testing in my shop. And now we also need to talk about material compatibility, because these two different machines use fundamentally different technologies to produce their laser beam. Our cheap laser is powered by a diode laser source, which runs at a wavelength of about 455 nanometers. And our $4,000 laser uses a CO2 laser source, which runs at a wavelength of 10,600 nanometers. And I'm not just throwing out those nanometer numbers just for fun, because the real-world impact of the difference between the wavelength is that the $4,000 laser can actually do a wider variety of materials when it comes to cutting and engraving. Most notably, if you want to do a lot of transparent materials like glass and certain types of acrylic, then our $4,000 example is going to be a lot better for that compared to a cheaper diode laser. And because these two lasers use different technologies, that also means that they have different maintenance needs. For example, the $4,000 laser will need to be filled with water and possibly antifreeze in order to help regulate the temperature of the glass tube. And it will also need to have the mirrors aligned, probably when you first get the machine, and possibly also from time to time afterwards. And if you compare that to the much cheaper D1 Pro, you don't have to do any of those steps on that machine. For the $4,000 laser, you'll also need to regularly clean the mirrors and the lens. Now, the cheaper laser doesn't have any mirrors to clean, so you don't have to worry about that, but it does have a lens and you need to clean that as well. However, in my experience, it's also more forgiving when it comes to the maintenance of cleaning the lens on the cheaper laser when compared to that of the more expensive P2 machine. And I talk more about that in my Xtool P2 review, and so if you're curious, you can check that out, and I'll link to it at the end of this video. Moving on. Difference number 5 is the bells and whistles that you get with each machine. Now, when you buy a car, you don't need heated seats, but it sure does make driving more pleasant in the winter. And in a similar way, the $4,000 laser is going to give you some features that you don't really need, but they sure are nice to have. For example, the P2 has an autofocus feature, which means you can set the height or the focus of the laser with the click of a button instead of using a manual process like a kickstand, which is what you get on the D1 Pro. It also has a camera system, which works incredibly well for positioning material inside of the working area, whereas on the D1 Pro, alignment is typically done using a jig or using framing. These still get the job done, but it's not quite as convenient as the camera system. And one quick note about that autofocus and camera system on the P2, both of these only work in Xtool's Creative Space software, neither one of them work in Lightburn, and I talk more about that again in my Xtool P2 review. Moving on to difference number 6, this is that some diode lasers like the D1 Pro actually have the ability to upgrade the power and wavelength by swapping out the laser head modules. For example, I could basically double the power of my laser by taking that 10-watt laser head right there and swapping it out for this 20-watt unit. both of these laser modules work on this same laser frame. And if your manufacturer offers the option, you might even be able to switch to a laser module that has a different wavelength. For example, Xtool offers an infrared laser module that works with the D1 Pro and allows you to mark on metal. Next up, let's talk about oversized engraving. The Xtool P2 has a pass-through slot that allows you to feed larger objects under the laser for engraving. And this is probably safer than doing an oversized engraving with an open frame laser like the D1 Pro. With that said, you actually can do oversized engravings with an open frame laser like the D1 Pro as well, using Lightburn's print and cut feature. And the benefit of using this type of machine is actually that you're not limited by the width of the pass-through slot on your machine. And so there's pros and cons to each one. Now, we've already talked about the fact that the more expensive P2 is the clear winner when it comes to power and speed. However, this extra performance comes at a bit of a cost, and that cost is slightly reduced precision. And the reason for this is actually pretty simple. The P2 has a wider or larger laser beam, and the larger the beam, the lower the detail possible on intricate or detailed engravings, like a photo engraving, for example. And that's why I still use this 10-watt Xtool D1 Pro for doing customer photo engravings, even though I also have the P2 over here in my shop. So which price point is the better value for the money? Well, I think that kind of depends on what you're going for. But what I can tell you is that for most people these days, I really wouldn't recommend one of these open frame lasers just because they're not very safe. And if you happen to be a beginner, I actually think that this $4,000 laser is probably a bit more than you need to spend unless you want to do a lot of glass and acrylic work, or if you just really want the bells and whistles that come with it. But if you ask me, I personally think that the ideal beginner laser is a 10-watt enclosed diode laser. Examples of this would be the Xtool S1 or something like the Raleigh Lasermatic MK2. Both of these currently sell for around $900, and if you want to know why I think that both the 10-watt power level and also the enclosed diode laser is sort of the sweet spot for beginners, then you can check out this video here where I talk about that in a lot more detail. Or if you want to see the Xtool P2 review that I talked about earlier in this video, you can find that over here. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye now.